Good afternoon. My name is Malia Cohen. I'm stepping in to chair today's meeting because the chair is detained in Southern California. So let's go ahead and begin at the top of our agenda. Mr. Charles, will you please call item 1?
Thank you. Roll call, Ms. Peralt.
Present.
Mr. Tang.
Present.
Mr. Juarez.
Present.
Vice Chairperson Cohen, you have a quorum.
Great, thank you very much. All right, could you please call the next item? The next item is an informational item. Board Education. Thank you.
I move to approve the committee agenda.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Let's back up for a second. Item number 1 is an action item to approve the agenda. Before we can take action on that item, we need to take public comment. Is there any public comment on approval of the agenda?
There are no members of the public in the queue.
All right, thank you. Colleagues, are there any questions, comments, ideas, inspirational moments, aha moments when it came to the agenda? None?
Move to approve.
Oh, okay, there's a motion to approve by Member Peralt. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, second. Do we need to do a roll call vote? Nope. Motion passes unanimously. All right, now
Yes.
let's get into the meat of things. Item number 2, a board education moment. We're going to hear a presentation from Peter Landers as well as Crystal Turco.
Thank you, Madam Controller. Good afternoon, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Crystal Turco, CalSTAR staff. Item 2 is an information item providing the committee education about compensation. At the highest level, topics that will be covered today include current industry trends, best practice in policy review, and the board's role in overseeing the compensation policy. The board's primary compensation consultant, Peter Landers from Global Governance Advisors, is here today and is going to facilitate this conversation with you. So with that, not to belabor my remarks, I'm going to turn this over to Peter.
Great, thank you. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Ms. Turco, and thanks everyone. I know it's a challenging time right now with what's going on in Southern California, so I really appreciate still being able to speak with you all today. Wanted to quickly go through this session, and this is meant to be a very open forum session. As questions come up, feel free to put yourselves in the queue, and happy to answer them as we go along. But as Crystal said, we're going to walk through very quickly just some trends we're seeing in the marketplace right now as it relates to both pension funds and just the overall asset management industry. And then we're going to walk through a little bit more the board and the committee's role in terms of setting compensation for staff members at CalSTARS. And then lastly, talk through some of the history of compensation at CalSTARS and how we've gotten to where you're at today. And there's been a lot of really great progress that's been made over the last 10, 15 years that you should be acknowledged for. And, we'll have a good frank discussion too about moving forward, what you want to look into as a committee. I know you recently, in the past year, have sort of reconstituted the compensation committee as a sort of subcommittee of the board as opposed to a committee of the whole. And so hopefully this discussion will, I think, elicit some great discussion on what you want to achieve in the next year or 2 years in terms of your work plans and things you want to focus on. And so hopefully some of these trends will spark some discussions. I want to start off quickly talking about current trends that we see in pension fund compensation. And some of these you're already well along the way in terms of being a leader. You are one of the largest funds, if not one of the top 2 funds in the United States. And so it's not surprising that you are on the leading edge in some of these areas. And then there's a couple of other things that I think, again, not in this specific session, but things that you can definitely look and speak about as you review compensation in the months and the years ahead. The first trend we're definitely seeing is regular reviews of peer groups, and this usually comes every 2 to 3 years as you're doing compensation studies. And the one thing I wanted to point out is, especially in the pension fund world, you have a bit of what we call a quasi-public sector nature to you, in that you are, obviously there's a public agency side to things, but you also are competing with the private sector, with other asset managers for talent, and you are not unique in this. There's a lot of other pension funds in North America, whether it's the larger US funds, whether it's large Canadian funds, they're in that similar position. And I think the good thing that you've done, and we would applaud you for this, is you do have a blended peer group. So you look at both a combination of public sector, public agency peers, along with a private sector comparison. And I think the mix that you have, especially as it relates to your executive management, where it's about 2/3 public, 1/3 private, is pretty standard that we see, and is a good blend between the two. So you're right in line with that trend. We're also seeing increased adoption year over year in terms of at-risk incentive plans. And you've done that. You've had an incentive plan in place for many years now. You've made a lot of really great adjustments over the years, whether it's to delegated authority over those plans, whether it's to certain weightings and total fund and all those types of things. So again, something that you continue to be aligned with in terms of having an incentive component to the pay program. And we'll talk in a second how those plans are even evolving. We're starting to see more and more discussion as well around looking at total fund only performance in the incentive program. So if you think of it, and I know you've had these discussions over the years about wanting to make sure that there's not as much differentiation between investment and non-investment staff, and making sure that everyone's working as one towards one sort of common goal. A lot of that philosophy and that methodology is starting to make its way more and more into pension funds to say we're less and less worried about potentially identifying specific asset classes and how they might be performing relative to others and to their benchmarks. And we're more worried about, when we're making investment decisions and striving for performance, we're focused on the total fund, the overall portfolio, and we're going to incent people based on that total incentive or that total fund portfolio approach. CalPERS, for example, has a plan that's very much focused on total fund performance only. There's some other leading pension funds across North America that have also started to look at that approach. I was speaking pretty recently with a leader of an endowment fund, and they were speaking about how they have seen the conversations evolve as well, even in the endowment space, around focusing more on that total overall portfolio as opposed to a total fund and an asset class breakdown between the two. So something that we're starting to see. The other thing that we're starting to see more and more discussion on, and I would say again in the US pension fund market, still the minority are in this situation, but we have seen some movement here, is this idea of long-term or deferred incentive compensation. And I know that's something we talked about a few years ago. It's been put on the back burner, but it is something that's starting to make its way in. Obviously, CalPERS had their plan they put in place. SWIB has put in a longer-term incentive plan, and even Texas Teachers in Virginia, they have put in not what I'd call traditional long-term incentive plans, but more of deferred incentive mechanisms where they take the incentive and you can it gets deferred over, say, a 2-year payment period, or they have the ability to take certain monies and actually reinvest them, and sort of that monies then track the overall return of the total fund of the system. So again, not something that 75% of funds are doing, but it is something that if we were doing this 3 or 4 years ago, we're starting to see a little bit of traction and moving in that direction. And then lastly, in terms of incentive eligibility, and I know this is something that you as a board and a committee have talked about over the years, we do generally tend to see roles like general counsel being part of the incentive plans, and definitely other non-investment roles, which I know you have your CFO and your COO, and that are under your authority that are part of the incentive plan, but that is just reinforcing that this is a common practice, not only for investment staff, but also for those key executive roles that are on more of the operations or the administration side of things. So I don't know if that solicits any questions, but I just wanted to highlight those key trends right now, and maybe I'll open it up if there are any quick questions.
Thank you very much. There are 2 questions. First, we're going to recognize Mr. Steve Juarez. Wait, hold on.
Thank you for that. I'm curious, how good do you think CalSTRS does in terms of doing a comparison to the private sector market? And I ask it in the vein that often having technically public sector employees making very large salaries, which can be wholly justified, is always going to be based against what they could draw in the private sector. So I'm curious, how good of a job do you think we do in that regard?
I think over the years you have done a really good job, and I think it comes down to even, I mentioned that you have a public sector component to your peer group. You are actually measuring as part of that public sector group against a lot of the leading pension funds in the United States and in Canada. And so those, even those public, I'll call them public agencies for lack of a better term, they are also dealing with similar challenges to you. They are trying to sort of bridge the divide between public sector and private sector pay rates. And I think overall, this board and this committee over the years has done a pretty good job in terms of recognizing you're never going to be the private sector, nor do you want to be the private sector, nor should any pension fund, because you have a lot of other characteristics that make working at a pension fund and the value add of working at a pension fund, even better than a private sector, whether it's, not having to hustle to bring in assets. You're just able to really, especially if you're on the investment side of things, focus just on the deals. Whether it's the ability to do good and to work towards, meeting that pension promise for all the members and supporting the thousands upon thousands of members. And there is a benefit to that. There are certain, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, other certain state things that you're able to get access to by working as part of, a state agency. So I think you've tried and have done a pretty good job of balancing out the public sector nature of this system with also competing with the private sector. And we often say when we're advising all of our pension fund clients, it's not about moving all the way to the private sector pay levels. I don't think that's even justifiable, but it is about bridging that divide between what is, say, a traditional public sector, maybe just salary only approach, bridging that divide so that you can bridge some of that gap from a pay perspective and then leverage some of these intrinsic things, whether it's, again, not having to hustle for assets, whether it's certain aspects of being in state government and things like that. So I would say you've done a pretty good job. It's always things you want to be mindful of, keep on top of, look at things like turnover rates, where you're losing talent to, and if you are starting to see a trend, having those frank discussions. But I think overall, historically, you've done a pretty good job in terms of balancing those two competing priorities.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Michelle Perrault.
Yeah, a quick clarification on the higher prevalence of the general counsel and other like non-investment
Yes.
folks in incentive plans. Is that in the public space only, or are you seeing that unilaterally across both private and public?
Unilaterally in both public and private. I would say in the private sector, you tend to have more of, not always the case, but more of an incentive for all. So you don't have necessarily the authority to set pay for everyone within CalSTRS. So in a private sector, you typically would see incentives sort of all the way down throughout the organization. But I would say for the roles that you as a committee and you as a board have authority over, it'd be pretty common to see all of those roles be incentive eligible for the most part. And I know the general counsel role historically has been one that you've decided not to make incentive eligible, but I would say overall it tends to be incentive eligible more often than not, both in the private and even for those public agencies that offer an incentive, they tend to offer that to a general counsel as well.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the clarification.
All right, seeing that there are no other questions,
Perfect. Well,
I think we're all on the same page now.
Perfect. One of the things we were also asked to talk about is this return to office.
Yes.
And that's obviously been a sticking point for a lot of organizations, both in asset management, both in pension funds, state governments, across all different industries. We at GGA are dealing with this exact issue right now of what the right strategy is. But some of the trends that we're definitely observing, and this is, I would say, across the asset management space, is definitely shifting away. Obviously during COVID, all of it was fully remote work, and there's definitely the movement to some form of return to work. I think things are still settling out. It seems like the most prevalent approach right now is a hybrid model that has 3 days in the office and 2 days out. And so I understand you right now have a 2 days in and 3 days out approach. So that actually might make you, from a talent attraction, even retention perspective, if you were to continue with that, a little bit more attractive to those that want a little bit more flexibility in when they have to come into the office and not. So that is something that I wanted to highlight there, because you do stick out as being a little bit more flexible as it relates to where we're seeing things going. And I'm sure you all have seen this in the news. I think JP Morgan is the biggest example of this with Jamie Dimon, is now you're seeing more and more, I'd say, asset managers in the private sector forcing employees to come in all 5 days a week. And so that is something probably in the private sector we'll start to see more and more. And I've often joked, certain organizations who have large commercial real estate things, there's probably an incentive for them to get people back in the office for some of their investments. But that is something that, you'll want to keep a track of, but I think that is more of what I'd say a private sector role. We'll see in the next few years how that evolves across the board, but definitely in the private sector, we're seeing more of that move to what I'll call the pre-COVID way of coming in every day. And I think, we've all probably heard these, but we wanted to highlight this for this committee. The reasons, I think, for return to office are, improved productivity of the teams, energizing innovation as people are able to work closer together and better sort of collaborate on certain things, better employee engagement. I think that's a huge one for a lot of organizations in terms of being able to, and it ties into the last piece about organizational culture, about having your employees engaged, being able to form that culture as an organization. And it's very difficult to do that, behind a computer screen. And so that is something that I think a lot of organizations are dealing with, and I'm sure you have over the years. And what's interesting is this last point. And when you look at some of the data, and we were working with Crystal and her team to look at CalSTRS trends in this area. While turnover definitely was higher, and I would say in that 2021 timeframe, it seemed to be a bit of a blip, because what you saw is after that 1 year blip, turnover rates, things like that, returned to more historical averages. And so I think while we saw some turnover issues when these things first came into place, you're now starting to see that trend stabilize. And so starting to see, a lot more consistent lack of turnover. Luckily, I think you at CalSTRS historically have been able to keep your turnover rates relatively low, which is great. That's a great sign for the culture and the engagement that you're looking to put in place. But it was something that stuck out to us. So again, maybe I'll quickly, I don't know if there's any other questions on this specific trend, but wanted to highlight some of these as you think through this in the weeks and months ahead.
We actually have two more questions. I want to recognize Member Peralt again.
You won't be surprised I'm going to ask this question, or at least the staff won't be. And you might not be able to answer it quite honestly, but I'm just kind of curious because we talk a lot about, this flexibility, this hybrid schedule, and what is that value? Like if you were to try to quantify what that value is, as a benefit, right, as an overall benefit. Do you, and maybe it who knows, but do you think that the flexibility, the added flexibility of a hybrid schedule that's allowed, do you think that makes a difference when somebody's looking at whether they go into, like, let's say the private sector where maybe their salary's a little higher and their incentives may be higher versus working in the public? And maybe that's a very personal decision, but are there any trends that you see, like what that impact of flexibility has when people are trying to make some of these decisions?
I'll speak more to just my own, and then Crystal might have some based on CalSTR's own experience. But I would say, it definitely is a benefit. I think ultimately, if someone is driven by the money and the huge opportunity, it's going to be tough because they're going to go to the private sector where they can make the most. But if someone, wants to make a very good living, be committed to a really great cause of, protecting the pensions for thousands upon thousands, if not millions, of members, and you're able to, again, provide them with flexibility, with certain things and protections potentially because of state, being a state agency and things like that. Some of these added factors, while it's tough to quantify them, I think would definitely be helpful to certain individuals. But to your point, I think it's going to be individual specific in terms of what are those person's ultimate aims, what are their sort of goals in life, and that's going to drive a lot of those decisions. I know you've opened up a San Francisco office too, which stuff like that will also make it easier because, while some people may really enjoy coming to Sacramento, those that want to live near a bigger city will probably like being able to work out of San Francisco. So I think the more flexibility you can provide in terms of where people can work from and things like that, while it's tough to quantify, it definitely, it's an added differentiator that doesn't hurt at the end of the day. But I'll defer to Crystal for any CalSTR specific.
I think I think it is a competitive advantage. I also think that we haven't fully realized perhaps what the benefit is. I'm glad that Peter brought up the San Francisco office because that was something we spoke as we were putting this presentation together. I don't know if we have trending data yet to fully articulate what the benefit is. Scott, I don't know. I don't know if you want to add anything to that space. Now, I don't know if, I don't know if we fully have that answer yet. I think in the state space, for example, we have a competitive advantage, but we're not just in the state space. So I think more to come, more to come.
It's just interesting. It'd be interesting.
I think it's very
All of
interesting.
those trends to see if we retain more because we're flexible.
Yeah, I think what would be interesting, especially in the investment space, and I realize there's, an executive group of positions here and an investment group, but we're more, as I have said in the past, we recruit more often for the investment positions. I think what would be interesting, and it is something that we pay attention to and we do track, is our vacancy rates, because the board is asking the investment team to execute on different strategies. And they do have more resources and they are looking for different talent and different skills. And I think that is the metric for investments that I pay a lot of attention to, because the vacancy rate is quite high for the organization. The retention is, very good and the turnover is very low, but vacancy is, we're constantly trying to bring in that talent. So I think that is something that we really need to pay attention to and make sure that the board has an awareness about some of those trends.
It'd be interesting to just see what we find, because I think from the state's perspective, we think it's an added benefit, right? It gives us an opportunity to provide sort of a recruitment tool that maybe some others aren't, but I'm not sure how much of that is just anecdotal or quantifiable. Exactly. So thank you.
Member Tang.
Yeah, so my question was that, you mentioned that there was a rise in turnovers, I think 2021, 2022. Was that something that was maybe the follow after COVID, or was there a trend that in comparison to other organizations that may have had that rise as well? And then a follow-up question to that is in regards to the folks who are being turnover, are they like investment employees or regular general employees that have other functions? Like kind of the segregation of the data on that?
So as far as turnover, I think historically during COVID, we saw the lowest rates of turnover for the organization that we had ever seen. When we started bringing employees back to the office, and it's been almost 3 years now, that first year we did see an increase across the board for the organization in turnover. That trend has again dropped to almost historical lows yet again. So I think it was in response to coming back into a hybrid work model where people either preferred to telework 100% of the time, or in some cases, some of the data we were getting, people were moving out of state. People, reassessed things during the pandemic and made career decisions that, it was a change in career for them or personal circumstance. So I think that was definitely a trend that we saw coming out of the pandemic and then instituting the return to work. The second part of your question was about, could you re-articulate that for me?
More of like segregating the data between staff.
I have the data. I don't know it off the top of my head. I believe, though, historically, when we see investment turnover, it's usually very specific reasons. And I would have to go back and look at the exit data. I'm sorry, I don't know it off the top of my head. But if memory serves me correct, it usually is very much focused on pursuing careers outside of state service. So promotional opportunities that typically are related to more compensation, typically in the private sector. But I will make a note of that and I can get that information to you, Ken.
And I'll just reiterate that, the trend that I think CalSTRS witnessed in terms of that 1 year blip, that is something that we, just like the trend says, we sort of noticed that across the board. Yeah. So a lot of organizations were dealing with those same challenges. And I think what people have realized now in this environment where we're seeing things go back to a hybrid environment is that, you're not necessarily, most places are moving towards a hybrid model. So it's not like if you leave one place, unless you maybe start your own consultancy or have a very flexible arrangement, you're going to have a similar hybrid type of environment anywhere. So I think that's part of the reason why you've seen the turnover rates sort of stabilize again, is because, there isn't that sort of thought that, well, this is the only firm that's requiring me to go to office. I think everyone's realizing that a lot of organizations are moving in that direction to a hybrid model. And so there isn't that added benefit of having that added flexibility. So I think that's why you're seeing things stabilize across the board, not just at CalSTRS.
Thank you. Colleagues, any other questions? None? All right. We can continue with the presentation.
Sounds great. And so, one of the things that all of our clients, not even just in the pension fund world or asset management across, is this idea of internal equity and making sure that, equivalent size roles that play, similar size are treated fairly and treated equally. And I think this comes from an overall philosophy, and I think you share this at CalSTRS, that, executive, investment, and non-investment roles are all important functions. Yes, you have, investments are important. You're obviously, doing investing, hundreds of billions of dollars of assets, but also you have an entire plan administration side. You have a call center. You have all these different roles that are also providing a valuable service to all of your members. And so you want to make sure that you're treating these roles as equitably as you can and show that both are equally valued. And I know that you as a board only have authority over certain executive staff and investment roles. And so, you have to do the best that you can with the authority that you have as an organization. But I think one of the big things, and I think you've been cognizant of this and have worked on this over the years, is reducing that view of executives, investment, and non-investment staff as different groups. You're all working as one. You're all working towards similar organizational goals, whether it's, meeting that overall actuarial rate of return, whether it's, acting in a sustainable manner, all these different things, not only just financial, but even on the non-financial side of things. And so you want everyone to be working together as one. And I know that's led from a compensation perspective to certain discussions, because when you look at some of the market data, certain market data will show that certain investment roles tend to be paid higher than other non-investment related roles. If you think of front office investment staff versus investment operation staff and investment service staff. And I think you have historically taken the view, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but this is the view you've taken, is you want to treat those generally pretty equally. So you have, similar salary bands, similar incentive opportunity levels for both your investment services and your frontline investment staff that are doing the deals and things like that. And that is a very valid philosophy, but it is one that if you're looking to do a review of your overall strategy, your philosophy on pay, it's something that you'll at least want to talk about as a board and make sure that's still meeting the goals that you as a board have. The other way you can think of it is not only through pay levels and pay opportunities, but pay design. And by that, I mean a couple of different things. One is who's incentive eligible and who's not. That's one way of doing things. The other way is how do you structure their overall pay in terms of, the weighting on total asset, total fund performance, individual performance, and things like that. And so those two buckets, whether it's through the structure of pay, how you pay people, or the levels of pay in terms of what's the pay band, what's the incentive opportunity, those are ways in which you as a board can use as levers in terms of creating that level of internal equity. And I will say this, because of the way market data spits out, there might be a situation where you say, we realize that when we look solely at the market data, our investment services staff are paid a little bit above potentially what the market is saying. But internal equity to us is more important than what we call external equity, and we'll talk about that in a second or two. But it's something to just consider, again, as you think through, potentially looking at your policy. You obviously have, an RFP, and you'll be hiring a potentially new consultant in the months ahead. That'll be something as you think through that strategy in the months ahead. This is one of the topics and areas you just want to confirm. How do we want to treat and approach these things in terms of our executive investment and those non-investment functions from an internal equity perspective. Don't know, again, if that solicits any questions, but happy to open it up. Seeing none or hearing none.
Nope, continue.
Perfect. This brings up to a good point. When to review your compensation policy. And one of the big times is prior to or soon after a major strategic change. And you do that for assurance of alignment with your new strategy, some different priorities, and also is to make sure you're reassuring stakeholders of the strategic alignment, because it's very important, especially when you have incentive programs in place, to make sure you're aligning pay with the performance that you're generating for your members. And I know in the past year or 2 years, you worked through with your investment consultants, thinking through a different way of benchmarking performance in certain areas. And I know you look to simplify some of your benchmarks. That is a potential area where I know you haven't really looked at it yet, but that is an area where you may want to look at your policy and say, is the way that we're now benchmarking our investment performance, does that tie in appropriately into the incentive program and how we incent our people and things like that? So that's a potential thing to look into now that you've made a bit of what I'd call a strategic change or a change in how you assess performance. You may also do it in response to staff or stakeholder pressures. So luckily you don't have this issue because you have relatively good turnover, but Crystal pointed out those vacancy rates. Potentially if those vacancy rates are getting even higher and you're starting to realize more and more pressures from staff, or you're hearing from stakeholders that they feel like the pay is out of whack or things like that, reviewing your policy, making sure you're still in line with typical market standards provides that assurance, and makes sure that you're meeting the needs of your staff members. And then lastly, it's just a good rule of thumb to review your policy every 3 to 5 years. I would say 5 years is probably on the longer end of things. Most of our clients look at it every 3 years. But every 3 to 5 years, I think you want to just make sure, is your policy still aligning with what you need as an organization? Because a lot can change in 3 to 5 years. Is it still aligning with market trends and where the market is heading? And again, it just makes sure that you're able to ensure your ongoing market competitiveness in the marketplace, and as well, just again, is a good governance practice to get into from that perspective. So again, not sure if there's any questions, but happy to move on if there isn't any.
Continue.
Great. So we talked a lot about trends and different things like that. Now we're going to focus a little bit more to provide a little bit more of the history of compensation at CalSTRS and a little bit more about the role that the board and you as a committee play. And I think it's important to delineate. So you have, authority over certain executive positions. So your CEO, CIO, COO, CFO, general counsel, and the system actuary, and then investment managers under your specific education code there. And I believe that goes down to your assistant portfolio, associate portfolio managers. And so you as a board have the authority to set the pay ranges and the incentive opportunities for those roles. In terms of the design of certain incentives, you have delegated over time through delegated authority to the CEO, working with the CIO to set the design for a lot of those roles. You obviously retain control over the CEO and the CIO positions, but that is what you have ultimate oversight over as a board. And that is delineated from, of course, the remaining part of the staff that aren't covered under the education code, which are more managed through the Department of Human Resources, and which have their pay benchmark based on public sector benchmarks and things like that. And I know that Crystal and the HR team are regularly working with CalHR. I know over the years, some of your investment officer positions have been made incentive eligible and things like that. But again, that is outside of your authority. But it is something that I know, staff are in talks with CalHR over the years on certain things on that front. And then in terms of the structure and the pay of what you offer, obviously there's a base salary, very common in the pension fund world. You obviously have an annual incentive opportunity as well. But you also have other forms of compensation. And I wanted to highlight this out because there are ways in which when you're trying to recruit individuals or people come in and they want to, get a certain level of education that they maybe don't have. You do have things like educational incentives. You have recruitment pay differentials. You have, for those that are taking on temporary roles or acting roles out of class, or pay differentials in those temporary scenarios that, get them closer to what a person playing that role on a full-time basis does, at least for that interim period. And then, of course, if you are relocating someone, you have the ability to, offer to reimburse certain relocation expenses. So there are other forms of compensation that you bring to the table. And then there are state employment benefits. So obviously there's the pension, which is a big one, benefits, leave, work-life balance, things like that. And I did want to quickly speak to the pension piece, because I know that comes up a lot in a lot of these discussions. And don't get me wrong, having a defined benefit pension is a really great benefit and value for people to have. But I think it is important to realize that some of the changes that were made about, I want to say 10 years ago now, in the state have made that pension less lucrative for newer employees and newer staff members. So those that have been here for a long time, they're grandfathered, they have that really nice, more lucrative pension. Those newer individuals, especially, you've probably been recruiting a lot of new people on the investment side of things. That pension benefit is not nearly as lucrative as the old one used to be because of some of the restrictions and limitations that have been put in place. So that, while it is still a differentiator against certain organizations, it's not as much of a differentiator as it once was. And so that's important to come in mind. And the other thing to keep in mind with that as well is for investment staff, especially, there was the question about competing with the private sector. While there is a benefit to the pension, it is dwarfed, and it is a relatively small percentage when you look at how much an annual incentive or a long-term incentive in the private sector pays out to these investment staff. So yes, it maybe fills some of the gap, but that is unfortunately more than covered by a lack of potentially long-term incentive and things like that. So just wanted to point that out as well. But it is, it is a perk of being in in a public agency that you have that defined benefit pension. But again, not as lucrative as it once was. And I'm sure Crystal and them can speak more to that as well. But that is just something that we've observed. And it's something that comes up not just with CalSTRS or with CalPERS, it comes up with a lot of our pension fund clients. And a lot of them, similar to you, have had to put in certain restrictions and limitations on those pension plans, which have, again, reduced the benefit that maybe once was there for longer standing employees. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Crystal, but.
No, I think you captured it.
Does this maybe solicit any questions from the committee? Awesome. Very quickly, too, I wanted to highlight the 3 key compensation principles that you have set as a board. And again, as part of any compensation policy review that you do in the coming months ahead, this is something, again, that you'll want to validate. One is you want to be internally equitable. I talked about that earlier. You've been very good in terms of, again, delineating between investment services, frontline investment staff, things like that. You want to make sure you're externally competitive. And that comes down to the peer group that you set. That comes down to you've targeted the median of that peer group in terms of where you want to position yourselves as an organization. I would say the median is the predominant practice. So most organizations will target the median of whatever peer group they decide on and say that's how we're going to determine whether we're competitive or not. And then lastly, you have said that you want to be incentive-based. So you want to have that pay-for-performance mentality. And that's where I think you've made a lot of improvements and enhancements over the years to your incentive program. You've made changes in terms of not only eligibility, adding new roles, but also just to the opportunity levels themselves to make sure that you remain competitive with other leading funds and even to a certain extent the private sector. So all 3 of those are the principles. And I would say, none of them, they're all very valid, but it is something that at least as you think through any kind of policy review, you'll want to revalidate this. Are there any that are missing that you want to add in? Are there any things that you want to tweak in terms of each of these areas and the wording that you use in that policy? So that is something that you'll want to review as you review your policy in the months ahead. Talked about this already, so I won't spend too much time, but on the peer group side of things. On the investment management side, you use a blend of large and complex institutional investors. That includes private sector comparisons. That also includes a lot of leading pension funds in North America, both Canadian and US larger size funds. And then on the executive management side, you have that specific defined blend. So 2/3 leading public funds, which again is a mixture of Canadian and US funds. I think there might even be, I can't remember if there's a couple of private plan sponsors in there. And then private sector firms weighted on 1/3 of that as well. So you're taking into account both public and private sector comparisons. And like I said, that 2/3, 1/3 mix That's generally, yeah, there might be some variations, but that's generally pretty close to what we see a lot of pension funds look at in terms of what that split looks like. Some of them actually formally adopt that. Some of them do it a little bit more on a qualitative basis or by looking at it a little bit differently, but they're both considered where they definitely have more of a weighting on the public side of things or other public funds, and then a lower weighting on the private sector side of things. So I think you're in a pretty good spot from that perspective as well. Then lastly, I'll try and quickly, this is a bit of an eyesore, but I'll try and cover the main points. I guess the key takeaway from this is you've done a lot of work over the last 15 years in terms of revising your policies, adding certain performance triggers on the incentive plan, making certain roles eligible for incentives that may not have been in the past, revising the performance scales for total fund and for different asset classes, and establishing updated salary ranges, updated incentive opportunity levels for various roles to make sure that you remain market competitive. And though while we didn't necessarily highlight it on this slide, I think it's also important to realize that on top of these things, you've also, and I think rightfully, said to yourselves, we need to delegate more authority to certain design changes and things like that to the CEO. And so you've done that to, again, align with good governance practices. And I'm sure you worked on that with your governance consultant over the years to figure out what that right delegation is. And then you've also made certain other tweaks in terms of certain weighting changes and things like that to, I think, recognize that, there are certain asset classes that you're looking at that are doing other things besides just trying to maximize an investment return, that value add return, and are in place, whether it's on the risk side of things, whether it's on the CIS side of things, that they're doing other things besides just focusing on maximizing that value add. And so you've updated certain incentive weightings and things like that to recognize that different asset classes might have slightly different priorities and objectives set out for them. So I think you've done a good job, and staff have done a good job over the years of, I think, looking at what makes sense, what is going to keep us market competitive, but also realize what are the major factors and objectives we want each of our people to sit on. So kudos to you for all of that. And I look forward to speaking. If you do have any questions on any of these milestones, happy to discuss them. And opens it up to a Q&A right now.
Are you able to talk about some of the milestones in depth? The one I'm looking at is in 2015, revised performance scale for total fund.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more in depth? I wasn't here.
Oh, yeah. No, not a problem. And Crystal, if I miss anything, I'm sure you can add in. But
Fine.
at that time, you had done a review, and I think this was done through the investment committee, to look at your investment benchmark for your total fund. And we helped in terms of doing some backward-looking analysis in terms of how you had performed relative to the old benchmark and the new total fund benchmark. And at that time, there was a revision in terms of the scale, in terms of the minimum stated 0 basis points, but I think the value add was reduced, I think, a little bit, because historically it had proven that it almost had been impossible for the total fund to hit that level of return. So there was, again, an updated benchmark and some really rigorous backward testing, both at what historical performance levels were, but also what the impact would be on incentive levels. And we were involved in a lot of that. Your investment consultant, I believe, was involved at the time as well. And so that led to, in 2015, a change in terms of what that performance scale looked like on the total fund basis. And again, I think that is something, in terms of what those hurdle rates are and those benchmarks, that is something that I think your investment committee works on with your investment consultant to validate those on a regular basis. We really just play more of the role of what is the impact on the incentive program from any changes. And so if that was something that you were looking to change in the future, that would be something where I think it would be a joint thing where investment consultant would give you advice on what those benchmark hurdles should be. And then we could definitely, as your consultant, look at what is the impact on the overall incentive program in terms of payout levels and things like that. So it was a really rigorous process that was followed. It wasn't just done in a vacuum. It took, I think, 2 or 3 meetings to get to the final answer on that. So it was a very rigorous process that was followed.
Very rigorous process, okay. Okay. In 2020 and 22, it says, at the bottom bullet says, initial discussions of potential long-term incentive, but no decision made.
Yes. Okay, great. So yeah, we were definitely involved in that. We had several meetings at the time, and we had talked through different alternatives for what a long-term incentive could look like at CalSTRS. At the time, you're still in the early stages of the collaborative model. We had come up with a potential design that might make sense. And I think at the time, you had made, as it says there in 2020, you'd made some material changes, I think, to certain incentive opportunity levels. And so at the time, I think there was some concern over just making sure that incentive opportunity levels were viewed as reasonable. You had just made some material changes pretty recently. And at the time, you'd looked at things like turnover rates and things like that. And I think there was a decision at that point to hold off and just stick with the incentive program that you had at the time, which again had a salary component and an annual, an incentive that's paid out on an annual basis, but based on longer term investment performance. But that is something, again, I know you put it on the back burner. I think for valid reasons, you had other priorities you were working through. But that is something, again, if you decide to move and do a sort of a full-fledged compensation policy review, that is something, again, you may not move in that direction, but it is something that I think you should work through and talk through as a board and as a committee to make sure you're comfortable with the overall design of pay at CalSTRS and that you're, again, aligned and you feel like you're market competitive in what you're offering. But there was some pretty good discussions there, but it was sort of felt to defer at that time. And it hasn't really been picked up since then, but it is something that I think, again, if you do a full-fledged review, definitely you should look at least have that conversation of the merits of how that might be able to help CalSTRS moving forward.
Thank you. Madam Chair, did you want to talk?
I don't want to talk about anything.
Okay, we'll move on.
I'm supposed to talk because I'm not on this committee. But thank you.
Okay, thanks for joining and hanging out with us.
I wanted to listen and learn.
Okay, all right. I have no other questions. I don't see any other names on the roster. Does that conclude your presentation?
Yes, it
Yeah.
does.
All right, good. Well, this is an education session, so we're not going to take public comment on this item? We can? All right, thank you. Is there any public comment on the education item that was presented?
There are no members of the public in the queue.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, then we can continue moving forward. Thank you for the presentation again. We're going to move on to item 3, which is the consent agenda. There's an action item. This is an approval of the minutes for the September 25th, 2024 Compensation Committee meeting. It was an open session meeting. Let's see if there's colleagues that have any discussion on this item. Seeing none, I see none. Okay, let's take public comment.
There are no members of the public in the queue.
All right, thank you very much. Is there a motion to approve?
Move the item.
All right, a motion has been made by Peralt. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Tang. Can we take this without objection? All right, without objection, thank you. Item passes unanimously. Let's call the next item, item 4, information item. It's the review of information requests. Is there
Yes, Vice Chairperson Cohen, there was a request. I think Mr. Tang had asked about the segregation of the data regarding return to office and retention between investments and other staff, and Ms. Turco is going to get back with data on that item.
All right, thank you, Mr. Gloverman. Mr. Tang, is there any other further comment? No? Okay. All right, well, let's keep going on. Let's move forward. Item 5, the draft agenda for next committee meeting.
Yes, so at your March meeting, you will be participating in interviews for the selection of your primary compensation consultant. As the committee is aware, there was an RFP that was issued. We're still in the evaluation phase. We have 4 responses. And so as to be determined how many people entities you will be interviewing in March.
All right, thank you so much. Let's see if there's anyone that would like to comment on this item.
There's no public comment for this item.
All right, thank you. We'll continue and move on to item 6. Item 6 is an opportunity for statements from the public. I'll open up the floor for any public comment at this time.
We have no members of the public in the queue.
All right, and so we see none in the chamber as well. Colleagues, any comment? No? All right, well, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you for